British police have arrested the founder of the WikiLeaks website, Julian Assange, and removed him from the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The Metropolitan Police say they were invited into the embassy after its government withdrew his asylum status. He's now thought to be en route to a central London police station. He's lived at the embassy since 2012. Well, with me now is our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. James, welcome to you. You broke this news. What do we know?
Well, what we know is that this is the product of a long negotiation between the British government and the Ecuadorian authorities. They have, under the current political leadership in Ecuador, they have become increasingly frustrated by the situation, Mr Assange being kept in their embassy in London for so long. They've been looking for a way of resolving the situation. So what happened is that the Ecuadorians agreed that they felt that Mr Assange had breached his asylum conditions. There are lots. If you claim asylum, there are lots of rules what you can and cannot do. You cannot, for example, engage in political activity and things like that. So they formally withdrew his asylum. And then they invited the British police onto Ecuadorian soil, namely their embassy, which allowed the British police to arrest Mr Assange for breaching bail. This is officially known as failing to surrender to the court. This dates back to the original allegations when there were extradition hearings. The United States wanted Mr Assange extradited to the United States, where he could face questioning for the release of all that information through what we now call WikiLeaks. Obviously, by going into entering the Ecuadorian embassy, he breached those bail conditions. So what's going to happen now is he's being taken to a central London police station, and the police say that he will be presented before Westminster Magistrates Court as soon as is possible.
Remind us of the background to this, because initially Julian Assange wanted, it was Sweden that wanted to question him on sexual assault allegations. Yes,
there was, as well as the Americans saying, look, we want to talk to Mr Assange about the WikiLeaks revelations, the Swedish authorities also wanted to talk to him about allegations that were sexual, about sexual offences that were allegedly made in Sweden. Now those charges have now lapsed. They have actually, but they can be restarted if the Swedish authorities wish to do that. But at the moment, they are not extant.
So what charges is he likely to face in a British court? Because we had a statement from the Home Secretary saying he's now in police custody and rightly facing justice in the UK.
Yes, those are for breaching bail conditions. So it's the charges that he'll face in the UK are for breaching bail.
His concern was that he did not want to be extradited to the United States, as you mentioned. Could that now happen?
It's possible. It depends entirely what the Americans say and do. It depends, first of all, what happens through the British judicial process, and then once that has happened, then the question remains, what action do the Americans want to take? Do they want to push ahead with extradition or not? So that's the first question we need to ask them.
And was there any response yet from Julian Assange's lawyers?
Not as yet.
OK, James, we'll let you go, but I know that you'll obviously be back with us as soon as there are more developments. Thank you. Well, as we were hearing, Mr Assange took refuge in the embassy 7 years ago to avoid extradition to Sweden over a sexual assault case that has since been dropped. Our correspondent Caroline Hawley looks back on how the case progressed. This report does contain some flash photography.
Julian Assange shot to fame with a massive spill of American state secrets. But it was then his personal life that put him at the centre of an international drama that's run for years.
See all those people standing down there?
This shocking footage first brought WikiLeaks to international attention.
That's a weapon. Come on, fire!
It shows the killing of a group of Iraqis, including 2 journalists, by a helicopter gunship. A flood of secret documents on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan followed, and then classified diplomatic cables. To his admirers, he became a champion of free speech and transparency. In the US, he is seen as a threat to national security. In 2010, Julian Assange found himself in a prison van and then in court after Sweden issued an arrest warrant, hoping to question him over allegations made by 2 Swedish women of sexual assault. Allegations he denies. Soon, to his supporters' delight, he was out on bail.
Well, it's great to smell fresh air of London again.
Under his bail conditions, he lived in this manor house in Norfolk, owned by a friend. He took his appeal against extradition to Sweden to the highest court in the land. But eventually, in 2012, he lost.
His appeal against extradition is accordingly dismissed.
The Embassy of Ecuador in London became his new home. He'd walked through its doors in June 2012 and asked for political asylum. It was granted. For the UK government, Mr Assange was a fugitive from justice. It spent millions policing the embassy before the round-the-clock guard was lifted. There were public addresses by Julian Assange from the embassy balcony.
Can you hear me?
This was 2017, on the day the Swedish investigation against him was dropped because prosecutors couldn't pursue the case in his absence.
Today is an important victory.
But Julian Assange stayed on inside the embassy, fearing that if he was arrested for skipping bail in the UK, he could be extradited to the US. Pamela Anderson was among those who used to go and see him, but last year his visits were strictly curtailed. Relations between Mr Assange and his hosts have badly soured. While he was inside, Ecuador had a change of government, and the now president described him as a stone in the shoe. He had new conditions imposed on his stay, including that he avoid online political activity and that he properly looked after his cat. Julian Assange went as far as taking the Ecuadorian government to court over the new rules and lost. He still has some fervent support, but the patience of his hosts has come to an end, and with it his long, long stay in Knightsbridge. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
We're going to make a short statement here outside this courthouse, and later on we'll try to be available to the press. Jennifer, we'll start here.
Since 2010, we've warned that Julian Assange would face prosecution and extradition to the United States for his publishing activities with WikiLeaks. Unfortunately, today we've been proven right. Mr Assange was arrested this morning at about 10 o'clock at the Ecuadorian embassy after the ambassador formally notified him that his asylum would be revoked, and he was arrested by British police. We've today received a warrant and a provisional extradition request from the United States alleging that he has conspired with Chelsea Manning in relation to the materials that were published by WikiLeaks in 2010. This sets a dangerous precedent for all media organisations and journalists in Europe and elsewhere around the world. This precedent means that any journalist can be extradited for prosecution in the United States for having published truthful information about the United States. I've just been with Mr Assange in the police cells. He wants to thank all of his supporters for their ongoing support, and he said, "I told you so."
Well, the only thing to add to this is the fact that this is a dark day for journalism. As Jennifer said, this sets a precedent. We don't want this to go forward. This has to be averted. The UK government needs to make a full assurance that a journalist will never be extradited to the United States for publishing activity. This pertains to publishing work 9 years ago, publishing of documents, of videos of killing of innocent civilians, exposure of war crimes. This is journalism. It's called conspiracy. It's conspiracy to commit journalism. So this has to end, and we urge everybody to support Julian Assange in fighting his extradition. Thank you.
What legal avenues are available to you to prevent his extradition?
We will be contesting and fighting extradition. We've requested that he now gets medical treatment. He's been refused medical treatment for the past 7.5 years, 7 years since being inside the embassy. We will be fighting extradition, and he'll be brought before the court again within the next month.
How is he now?
We're not going to be taking any more questions today. Thank you very much.
Health problems?
You were asking about the elements in the extradition request. It is quite obvious that the US authorities have picked just one element of what they have been working on for a long time, including the Espionage Act, acts that have decades in prison. There is no assurance that there will not be additional charges when he is on US soil, and I think and I believe that this was an angle in the approach to increase the likelihood of him being extradited. That is obvious.
Do you have anything to say about the Ecuadorian embassy and the way he was arrested this morning?
Free! Free! Free Assange! Free! Free! Free Assange! Free! Free! Free Assange! Free! Free! Free Assange!
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
The U.S. has announced charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange just hours after he was taken into custody in London. Assange was dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy where he's been for the last 7 years. His arrest came after Ecuador dropped his asylum status, essentially evicting him from the embassy.
The U.S. has requested Assange be extradited, and British authorities have confirmed he was placed under arrest on behalf of U.S. law enforcement. Now, there are also multiple reports that Assange was actually found guilty by a U.K. judge of skipping bail. He faces a maximum sentence of 12 months in prison on that charge. Ellen Nakashima joins us now. She's a national security reporter for The Washington Post. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us. So let's get into what Assange is facing. He's accused of conspiring with former NSA contractor. Well, actually, Chelsea Manning wasn't an NSA contractor. Chelsea Manning was an Army.
She was in the Army. She was in the Army.
Part of the military, right? Chelsea Manning conspiring with her to publish secret military documents. What more do we know about what exactly Assange is accused of doing?
He's charged with one count of conspiring to commit computer intrusion, or that is to help Chelsea Manning attempt to crack a password to allow her to get into a classified DoD network under a different identity or name so as to hide her tracks, an attempt to get access to these classified documents, hiding her true identity.
So, all right,
so there's no evidence that it was successful, however. There's no evidence in the indictment to suggest that Assange was successful in cracking that password. In fact, I think he wasn't.
So the documents that Chelsea Manning managed to take are we saying, are authorities basically saying that Chelsea Manning got those sort of on her own, but then there were additional documents that perhaps Julian Assange was attempting to get as well?
Yes, the indictment says that prior to Assange trying to help crack the password, Manning had already passed over hundreds of thousands of documents to Assange, even without having cracked the password.
So what I find really interesting, Ellen, is the discussion that we were having earlier with Michael Morrell, who's a former deputy director of the CIA, which is how WikiLeaks got its hands on all this information. Was it provided to them via the Russians? And if it was provided to them via the Russians, was it the Russian intelligence operatives that were giving them this information? That's the first question. And then the argument that they've always made, which is that they are journalists, that they're doing journalism, whereas Michael Morrell says, no, this doesn't appear to be journalism. This is acting as a foreign entity, a foreign agent.
But I think it's important to clarify, too, when we talk about Russians, we're not talking about Chelsea Manning. We're talking about the accusations that have to do with meddling in the 2016 election.
Right.
Yeah, so the charge against Julian Assange at this point has nothing to do with the 2016 election or Russian interference or WikiLeaks' dump of hacked DNC emails. It is only in relation to the 2010 release of DoD some classified materials and State Department cables. So that happened years ago, right? 6 years before the 2016 election. What I think Michael Morrell is referring to in the case of the 2016 election, and then even beyond that, WikiLeaks put out hacked or stolen hacking tools from the CIA, put them up online, and that was also a breach of classified information, which led then CIA Director Pompeo to call WikiLeaks a hostile intelligence or foreign intelligence agency or service, seeming to try to draw a connection or a distinction between an organization like WikiLeaks and a journalistic organization like the New York Times or the Washington Post.
It's really interesting.
It really is. I presume that will be part of the defense should
Absolutely.
he arrive here. So if he's extradited, do we have any idea sort of how long that could take and what he'll face once he gets here?
Oh, that could take, the process is often lengthy, could take months, sometimes years, and Assange's lawyers are expected to mount a very vigorous fight against his extradition. Already lawyers are saying, look, making the case that WikiLeaks is a journalistic organization, and to attempt to prosecute him sets a bad precedent for freedom of the press. So you can already sort of see for the arguments they're going to start to make. They want to turn that into a political argument internationally. And so the Justice Department is being very careful to try to avoid charges that can be seen as politically motivated, such as charging him with violation of the Espionage Act. We don't see any such charge here. We see is this charge that's more related to computer hacking, which is one way they hope to avoid the entanglement with the First Amendment issue.
You know, Ellen, when the Justice Department began investigating WikiLeaks and Assange, it was under the Obama administration. It was Eric Holder. It was a different administration. We've all been watching the new Attorney General testify before Congress over the past couple of days. Clearly, this is a different type of Attorney General and a different administration. You know, how do you think Julian Assange will fare, or does any of that even matter?
Yeah, look, I do think under this administration and this Justice Department, I think they're being more aggressive or forward-leaning in exploring or probing the area that there's a difference between, say, WikiLeaks and a traditional journalistic organization. Under the previous administration, the Obama administration, they brought more leak prosecutions than in all prior administrations combined. So they were also no slouches when it came to leaks. But this administration is also, I think, showing more willingness to even try to take on prosecution of Assange, even if they may run into challenges with the First Amendment.
All right, really fascinating details there. Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post, thanks for your reporting. We appreciate it.
Thank you.